There, Mike McDonald, the Managing Director from MMD Global Advisory, here to share his insights on the latest note that he published on the institutional resilience and the value of compounding returns. So why is institutional resilience important? And what do you mean when you say institution?
Well, Jay, and it's great to be with you and to talk about the paper and to talk about what I think is a timely subject. But also, I'd just like to add or preface at the onset of our presentation or our discussion that, for folks thinking about the situation, say in the U.S., the U.S. economy, in the U.S. market, that institutions in the U.S., despite a lot of political drama that we see in the media, are working. And I do think that the electoral transition, even with all the drama that may attend it, is going to work out. And I think we have to bear that in mind and keep that in mind in terms of the resilience of U.S. institutions. In terms of the questions that you've asked, I'd like to take the second part of that question first, or those questions first. What are institutions? What do we mean by institutions? Institutions are the agreements that we as a society enact formally and observe. They govern our political, our social, our economic behavior, our economic, political, and social lives. And the reason why resilient institutions are important is they allow for certainty. And certainty, for the investor is a critical ingredient in terms of how he or she thinks about what kind of capital to commit, where to commit it, and whether or not that's going to be worthwhile in terms of the returns that capital can generate.
So this correlation between institutional resilience and compounding returns, what does this mean for the investor?
Again, as I was kind of, as I was implying, and I'd like to, elaborate on this a little bit. Stable, resilient institutions buy time, so to speak, for the investor. And by that, I mean that an investor who commits capital in an environment with resilient and stable institutions benefits from the phenomenon much more easily of compounding returns. There is much less, if not negligible, danger of an arbitrary and from left field sort of interruption and, in fact, confiscation, or having the rug pulled out from under you in terms of the investment of capital that you've made. Institutional resilience, when you see it evident in an environment, means that you're much more able to ascertain what the risk is in the economic and commercial sense, and you're much more able to risk discriminate effectively because you know the lay of the land, the terms of the contract, the social conventions, economic and political conventions that you can rely upon to realize the value of your asset. Again, I just want to emphasize, stable institutions, resilient institutions buy you time to allow for the compounding of returns.
In your note, you described the political risk curve for the investor. What is it and why is it useful?
Well, it's useful because it allows for a graphical examination, so to speak. It allows for for an assessment of how strong or how weak institutions may be, and therefore how you can ascertain what your risk tolerance is, or your tolerance, so to speak, for uncertainty in terms of investing in a particular environment. The political risk curve is populated by measures produced by the World Bank called the World Governance Indicators. And the World Governance Indicators, or that aspect of the indicators that we use, are percentile rankings of World Governance Indicators measuring resident behavior in a specific country in terms of their confidence and their opinion on the strength of institutions there. The surveys represent the compiling by the World Bank in terms of resident sentiment with respect to the measures we use in the political risk curve, voice and accountability, rule of law, control of corruption, and general ambient political stability within that particular country environment. What's great about looking at the political risk curve is you make use of the systematic, consistently applied methodology developed by the World Bank, and you're able to draw a comparative review again of different countries of risk and where different investment, and therefore where different investment opportunities may be for you. What's very effective, we think as well, is that you're able to, and we're able to, based on drawing on the information from Swiss Life, the comparative measures of the world governance indicators in terms of countries that have actually defaulted, so to speak, invoked political risk insurance claims, and countries which have not. And we look at those average world governance indicator scores for both defaulting and non-defaulting companies, again, where the averages are looking at the WGI scores for countries where political risk insurance claims have been tripped and where they have never been tripped. With respect to the United States, in terms of the world governance indicator measures that I mentioned, the US performs pretty well in terms of voice and accountability, in terms of ambient or local political stability, in terms of rule of law, and in terms of control of corruption, which points to really a resilient institutional environment in the United States, and therefore an environment that is generally very conducive for investing.
Lastly, Mike, you cite the year 2000 US presidential election as an example of resilience. Can you elaborate on that? And using that as a historical episode, what might that imply for the US national election coming up this November?
It's a great question and a great lead in terms of what's in store for us now with this upcoming November 3rd election. And I think it's very interesting to think of the November 3rd election in the context of what happened in the year 2000 in the election between Al Gore and George W. Bush. That was, like today, a highly polarizing election that was bitterly fought and that was extremely tight, extremely close. The election seemed to come down to the voting count in the state of Florida. The voting count was contested. Initially, it found for George W. Bush. That count was contested by the Democratic Party, by Al Gore's campaign. And to make a much longer serpentine story much shorter, the contesting of that election arrived at the door of the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court found that because of the differing standards of counting votes in different counties in Florida, that there was a violation of the Equality Clause in the Constitution. Therefore, the court found for the initial result endorsed by the Secretary of State of Florida, which found that Bush had won that state by just under 500 votes or so, and therefore had enough electoral votes to win the presidency of the United States, to win that election. The important thing to think about is that this was indeed a highly contested election, and tempers were frayed, and emotions, I dare say, were a little bit raw. And yet, American citizens and residents complied and observed the finding of the Supreme Court. They had an express buy-in to the results of that institutional process to accept the results of the election and to go about their business and to continue life with a new president, in this case, George W. Bush, for that 2000 presidential term. Institutions worked, society was stable, and the electoral transition of power took place. Now, we have kind of a parallel situation with the presidential race between Donald J. Trump, the current president of the United States, and Joe Biden. That is, just like the race in 2000, a highly contested, highly polarizing race. I think that there could be a lot of drama attending this race. Maybe initial results may not be too clear, but I am confident that the institutions, the political and social and economic institutions in the United States will allow for the center to hold and for the electoral process to take place and for an effective transition of power to take place. I think that history has been a bit of an example with the year 2000 election, and I think the institutional evidence, so to speak, of durability in the United States is pretty strong. One thing to think about, and it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, is that in the United States, the Census Bureau determined for the year 2017, there were roughly over 126 million households. And you think about that for a second. Obviously a huge society. For the same, or for I guess I should say the fiscal year of 2017, the Internal Revenue Service in the United States tallied or counted over 150 million individual tax returns filed. Think about that. Obviously, there are two-person or three-person individual tax filers in a particular household, or something to that extent. But what's important is the wholesale compliance, voluntary compliance of U.S. society, of U.S. citizens to file their tax returns. That shows a grassroots buy-in to the way institutions largely work in the United States. And that shows a certain inherent, or at least very robust, institutional resilience. I think that kind of puts into context some of the political drama that we're seeing